Um, and so with that, I am delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Annie Winson from the British Geological Survey. So Annie is a multi-hazard scientist here at the BGS and has a long history of working in volcanic hazard assessment. So as a graduate from the MSc Natural Hazards programme at the University of Bristol, she went on to complete her PhD at the Earth Observatory of Singapore. In Singapore, she was working on understanding explosive eruptions, so developing tools for forecasting explosive activity and modelling the associated hazards. Following a short research post, she then came back to the UK and held lecturer positions at Aberystwyth and Kingston before joining the BGS in 2018. So she's now in the geology and remote sensing team, and Annie's worked on multi-hazard projects in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and today she's going to be talking to us about a project based in Colombia. Annie's been a COMET scientist since 2022, and very excitingly, as of this week, has also taken a new post as Science Advisor for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the Research and Evidence Directorate. I hope that's a suitable intro. So Annie, whenever you're ready, it's over to you and you can share your screen.
Okay, so hopefully you can see this. Does that come up now?
Yeah, that all looks good.
Okay, let's get this started then. All right, well, thank you so much for asking me to come and talk today about the work that we have been doing in South America, in Brazil and in Colombia. I know, a little bit of a different kind of COMET talk. I'm afraid I'm not going to be talking about INSAR at all, but what we're going to be talking about here is community-driven natural hazard and physical vulnerability understanding that kind of help us develop this more collaborative understanding of where risks are in communities and how communities can take action against them. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. A lot of the work that I'm going to discuss was part of the Urbe LATAM project. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction into that. And then we're going to talk a bit about community hazard perception mapping, the methodology we defined to derive physical vulnerability of these community buildings, and the outcomes of the project. And I just want to acknowledge at the top of this talk all of the partners that you can see represented at the bottom of this slide. As the talk goes on, you'll see that it would have been completely impossible for us to have the kind of outcomes from this project without the support of this really wide network of scientists that we were able to work with. So we were really, really lucky in that respect. So let's just think about what the context is of urbanization in Latin America, and specifically in the context of climate change. So in Latin America and in cities like Medellin, where we were working, we've seen accelerated urban growth in the last 50 years. And these are now some of the most urbanized areas in the world. And of course, this won't be a surprise to the people on this talk that this means that we get a proliferation of marginalized urban neighborhoods into areas where buildings wouldn't have existed in the past, into parts of land that are disproportionately exposed to hazards. And then, of course, these communities themselves also have less economic and social capital to adapt and to respond to hazards. And of course, because of climate change, we expect to see an increase in the types of hazards that affect these very steep marginal areas, such as landslides and flooding events. And just on the side of this screen, you can see here the images from two of the communities that we worked in. So at the top here, this is El Pacífico in Medellin, Colombia, and in the bottom, this is Niterói Promontorio in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So the Urbe LATAM project was a GCRF-funded project that was about understanding the risks and building enhanced capabilities in Latin American cities. And it was led by João de Albuquerque from the University of Glasgow, and it was seeking to understand and refine understanding of risks and vulnerabilities related to these kind of rain-related geohazards in Latin America. And specifically, we wanted to think about how data was produced and used and how it might close an implementation gap in delivering equitable resilience for marginalized communities. So understanding how communities that may not have the same amount of representation politically, for example, how they might actually take action to reduce their vulnerability and their risk, and how we might support that. So it was a great events that we had in February 2020. We all met in Rio de Janeiro. We had a fantastic meeting with all of the partners from Brazil and Colombia, and we defined the project as kickoff meetings do. We were very expansive in our plans, and we had all these great ideas. But of course, February 2020 did not give us much time before, unfortunately, the pandemic started, and a lot of those plans had to be refocused. And so in the work package that BGS was part of, the components that we needed to start considering were how we were going to engage with citizens in communities and generate data about local vulnerabilities, and also integrate new forms of citizen-generated data with conventional data sources. So how we bring together the local understanding of hazard and risk with the data sources that we as scientists are probably slightly more comfortable with. And as I said, this was in 2 communities in El Pacífico in Medellín and Proventorio in Rio de Janeiro. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the approach that we took in Medellín. It did become quite clear through the project that obviously the community needs were quite different, and also the understanding and the kind of background knowledge in the community was quite different. In Medellín, we were able to have more interaction with the community through COVID, and so I'm going to focus on some of the outputs that we had there. But obviously, we did sort of have this transfer of learning to Proventorio as well, and we were able to produce the same products for them as well. So let's think about Colombia in general and the kind of disaster risk management landscape in Colombia. So Colombia actually has made really big efforts in providing information on indicator compliance for the Sunday framework. And this has enabled them to install some early warning systems. And that's been made possible by incorporating risk management actions into their development plans. And those are aligned with SDGs from national to local level. So there is this National System for Disaster Risk Reduction Management that was established by law in 2012, and it was adopted into the National Policy for Disaster Risk Management. So this is part of the kind of fabric of the legal system in Colombia now. What is less clear, however, is how this kind of institutional structure is related to these communities that actually are sort of on the cutting edge of those disasters, and these more marginalized communities where we may have populations who are potentially unregistered or also just not represented politically. And so in El Pacífico and Medellín, this is a self-built neighborhood. It's a commune of 8 areas of the city of Medellín. And if you can see from these pictures here, it's incredibly steep slopes and the buildings are quite close together in places. The population of this community is estimated at around 1,100 inhabitants, and that's distributed across 350 households residing in 345 dwellings. And a lot of the people who have settled in this area were actually displaced themselves during the armed conflicts in the 80s and 90s. So this is a community that has had to come together in a new location because of those tensions. And it is a community that is considered to be highly socioeconomically vulnerable. So again, as we were saying before, those more marginalized areas of the city. And this is a quote from one of the people from the project, one of our community researchers, who said very powerfully that they felt that they were recognized by the city of Medellín when it came to taxing them for their property and for their services to arrive. But from an administration level, they didn't really feel that there was much recognition. And so when it came to kind of advocating for what their needs were around things like hazards, there wasn't always the interaction that they were looking for. And so in this community, they were very, very positive about engaging themselves so that they could be armed with the knowledge they needed when they went to then advocate for themselves and for their needs. So if we look at some of the existing maps of Medellín and the existing hazard maps, unfortunately, this area is quite underrepresented. And so it was really difficult for us to kind of understand the vulnerability of the community because we didn't actually have a very comprehensive map of the community. And so we identified as part of the project that this would be the first step that we would need to do, that we would actually need to map the community that we were working in. As I said, we needed to mobilize any available resources to develop this mapping, unfortunately during a pandemic. And we wanted to do participatory mapping, which meant that we needed to bring people together. And of course, we couldn't physically bring people together. And as I say here, in confinement and with low-cost tools. So the way around this is that we went to our colleagues and our friends at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, and they helped us to launch this mapathon of El Pacifico. And we were able to create, by analysing satellite imagery, a comprehensive map of the area of the settlement, which was then labelled with the community volunteers with the numbers relevant that were relevant for the building. So we were able to give the buildings all an individual code, which we then could refer to later on in the project. So this was a really big step for us to be able to actually have this map to refer to and to get everybody on the same page. And I wanted to just have a quick note on terminology as well. I'm talking a lot about vulnerability here, and the UN ISDR definition here is conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors. But indeed, in this project, we really focus on the physical vulnerability, and specifically the physical vulnerability of buildings to hazards. So we are thinking here about whether or not a building is going to be impacted by a hazard, and if it is, how vulnerable it will be to that hazard. So will it collapse? Will it survive? Will it be livable? All those kind of questions. We also talk a lot about participatory mapping, and as many of you will know, this includes approaches where stakeholders are involved in the knowledge production process, and we can therefore incorporate this local knowledge to provide information that's not readily available from other sources. And this was really important in El Pacifico because, as you can see, they're already we needed just from the ground up really to create these maps with the community. So in thinking about the risk to this area, the first thing that we needed to start considering was the hazard. And El Pacifico does not appear or appears at very coarse resolution on the Medellin hazard maps for landslide and for flooding. So we needed to try and tune those maps so that they were more appropriate for the needs of the community. And we determined that the best way to do this was to go through a hazard perception mapping exercise. So the two hazards that I'm going to talk about are landslide and this hazard that is quite specifically in this region called torrential avenues. So these can be thought of as flash floods that are sort of hyper-concentrated flows. We retained the nomenclature that the community is comfortable with because obviously this is an output that is meant for them. So, and this was kind of brought really to the fore because unfortunately in September 2020, whilst this community was dealing with the impacts of the pandemic, they also then had to deal with a torrential avenue event with a large flash flood event, which caused quite a lot of destruction in the community and obviously kind of raised the profile of these events again for them and the potential impacts that they may have. So this is some photos that were taken by some of our colleagues in the community, by some of the community researchers, to show the events in progress and also the damage after the fact. So you can see that there's really some quite large pieces of material being brought down in these events and that they're damaging these buildings that they're impacting. So this channel runs all the way through the center of the community. So obviously the community identified that this was something that they were concerned about and a hazard they wanted to focus on. So we created with them, based on the sort of historic events that have occurred in the community, this community consensus on hazards map. And we talked to them about the kind of hazards that they were concerned about. And as I said, obviously torrential avenues came up as there was a recent event on this channel here that runs through the community. But also they identified landslide and rockfall as a key concern of theirs. So this this edge of the community here is quite a steep escarpment behind them, and they had rockfall and mass movement events from here. They've also seen landslides in the past, both in this channel and outside of it as well. So they are concerned about those hazards. The other concern for them is that until recently, they were the community that was highest up on the slope, and they had made a lot of efforts to ensure that there was not a lot of deforestation above them, that they managed the slope so that it wouldn't fail, essentially. But in recent years, there's been a further expansion of development above El Pacifico on these slopes, and they are seeing an increase, or they feel that they're seeing an increase in mass movement events as a consequence of those. And so they are concerned, and there was community concern around that, which led them to want to look at this as one of the hazards that they are focusing on. So to conduct this participatory mapping, we brought together 16 participants, and this was in COVID safe requirements for the time, so this was a bit later on. And this included the community researchers who live and work in the community. And what we asked them all to do was produce a hand-drawn map of each hazard, so of the 3 hazards we were looking at, and identify where they thought the hazards were high, medium, or low. And we guided this mapping exercise by asking them questions like, where do you always see this hazard? Where have you never seen this hazard? And where do you sometimes see this hazard? To try and get them to think about, in their memory, where they have seen these hazards and where they would be worried about them. And so each of them produced a map like this. I hope you can see my cursor on here. And from here, we were able to digitize this map to produce then separate hazard perception maps for each of the attendees. We asked the attendees to work in groups as well, and then come up with a consensus map. And we were then able to generate sort of a single consensus map from the team of people that had worked on that. And essentially, we did this by always picking the higher value for a pixel. So if a pixel was both identified as low and medium hazard in 2 different outputs, then it would be given a medium hazard value. So we created what we hope would be the worst case scenario hazard map. And as I said, we created these medium maps for the worst case scenarios for each group, and then computed from their residuals as well. So we were able to look at the differences between the two, between the maps that had been produced. So actually what we saw was that there was quite a lot of consensus in both the rockfall and torrential avenue maps, but the one that was most variable was the landslide output. And this kind of makes sense to us because the landslide output the landslide hazard is the least common in the area, so we would expect to see some uncertainty in that case. And so the final hazard maps that were created look more like this. So this is for torrential avenue, this is for rockfall, and this is for landslide. And as you can see now, we can have this creek running through, excuse me, and we are picking up areas of higher and lower relative hazard for these 3 different events. So once we had the hazard maps, the next thing that we needed to try and do is assess the physical vulnerability of the community. And to do this, we came up with a workflow that was iterative and that worked with the community to ensure that they were engaged and also that they were comfortable with the decisions that were being made. Oh, excuse me, sorry. So as a consequence of this, we had 184 homes sign up to be part of this, and that equated to 780 inhabitants. Obviously, there was no pressure on the community to be part of this if they didn't want to be, and the community engagement officers only went out to the homes that had already identified that they were interested. So the vulnerability factors that we decided to look at, which were determined with our colleagues in Colombia and with the community, were things like the material of construction, the number of floors, the roofing material, the material that the ground floor was made of, whether or not the building had been reinforced, and how close the building was to both the channel and also the backscarp of the community. So we are able to classify this some weighting factors on the basis of these different criteria to think about whether or not that makes the building more or less vulnerable to the hazard. After this, we conducted a household survey where the community researchers went, excuse me, okay, hopefully that's better. So the community researchers went to every single household and took a photograph of that house and of the material. And then we had a process where we went through all of those pictures and attached information that we could gather from the pictures to the community map so that we were able to say, okay, this is what we think these criteria are. So how many stories, what material the building was made out of, what material the roof was made out of, etc. And if we got to a point where we didn't feel like we had enough information, then we asked the community researchers to go back and take more pictures or gather more information. So this was sort of an iterative data collection process. Let's move. Okay, so once we had these initial maps, then we were able to start weighting the vulnerability criteria relative to each other. So this is the formula that we used, but we used this to create some presentation maps, which we then could show to the community. We also wanted some validation of the vulnerability weighting factors that we had designed. So we did this through a community-wide survey. So we've created a booklet of information, and we asked the members of the community to go through and give their opinion on some of the information that we'd collected. And this including some of the photos that we had taken and asking them to give values in terms of like high, medium, and low, or number of floors, or what quality the building was, that kind of thing. And then we equated that to the numbers that we had generated to check that we really had kind of got the vulnerability in a similar sort of area, if that makes sense, or a similar sort of value. And this was quite an entertaining component, because what we found was, of course, we as researchers didn't know anything about any of the families here, but obviously the community did, so they were providing more information about why they thought values should be what they were, which was quite interesting. So then from here, we were able to create these final physical vulnerability maps. And I should say that these are relative vulnerability maps, right? Because the hazards are relative to each other. And we were able to use these to talk to the community about which buildings were likely to be more or less vulnerable to which hazards. And also I should say that throughout this, what we found was that when the map started to be presented back to the communities, some of the people who had initially elected not to be part of the study actually then did want to be part of it, because obviously they were looking at this and saying, well, my house isn't on here and I'm interested to know what the outcomes might be for my property. So this kind of iterative process was also really good in terms of getting more and increasing engagement. And I just have to really credit the community researchers who worked with us on this project, because they were fantastic at driving that engagement and making sure that people were, really getting as involved as they could be. And then finally, we went through this phase of presenting the outcome maps to the community. And this is a photograph of them up on the wall in their community centre. They are showing them to some local decision makers who've come, and this is the project PI here as well, who's looking with them at some of these. So some of the members of the team were able to get out into the community towards the end of the project, which was great. So the outcomes of this project, I think, were really great because what we found was that the community response was fantastic. And what has happened now is that they are using these maps to advocate for themselves to local decision makers. So these maps have remained up on the walls of the community centre. And when local politicians or local decision makers come into the community, they're able to show them on these maps what their concerns are, what they want to have help with, and what they want to kind of try and manage. And it's given, or it's increased and kind of formalized the knowledge that they already had in the community in a way that allows them to kind of advocate and stand up for what they believe they need. They've continued to add buildings to the survey themselves. So I should say that the methodology that we designed, we used tools that were easily available. So the model itself is actually just built in Excel. So they are able to update that themselves and continue adding buildings. So as I said before, what we saw is that community members who'd elected not to be involved initially did then decide to become involved once they saw the outputs of the project. So they are now able to kind of run with this, and this has continued beyond the end of the project, which is great. They've also made the decision to remove some of the buildings that they considered to be highly vulnerable. So this was specifically some of the buildings at the very top end of the community, one of which was owned by one of the community leaders, actually. And they decided that they were such high risk, specifically from the torrential avenues, that it wasn't a good idea for people to be living in them. So they've taken, I believe, 2 properties down from the top end of the community. The people who are living there have been rehomed elsewhere in the community, and they've actually turned that space now into a community garden. Because they understood that having an increased amount of vegetation may actually kind of limit some of the impacts, but also COVID really sort of demonstrated to them the potential risk they were at from food insecurity. So they wanted to have a space to be able to grow at least some produce within the community, and that's what they're doing there now. They also have been running for local communities a risk school. So some of the areas around them, some of the communities around them, started to see what they were doing, started to see what they were working on, and they sort of said, well, we'd quite like to do that in our area. We'd like to do that in our region. And so they have been running, or they were running, I believe every Sunday last August, they did a risk school for their surrounding communities where they were able to pass on some of this knowledge that they have now got and start these buildings kind of surveys elsewhere as well. And this is just a little article that they were sort of in the national news for doing this, international news, sorry, for doing this. So I think, well, I hope that you can see that the outcome of this project has been sort of the thing that I think a lot of us hope for, which is that it's outlasted the end of the funding. And if you want any more information, then I can direct you to these resources that were produced by our colleagues in Colombia and in the community. I also just wanted to credit all of the people who were involved in this work, but specifically my colleague Alejo Willis here, who is a fantastic researcher for Colombia. And if you are interested in understanding more about what we've done, we do have a preprint in review at the moment with NHES. I'm sorry, I realise I've not actually taken up 40 minutes, but hopefully there are some questions, Sophie. And I apologize for the coughing as well.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Annie. And please, yeah, take a breath and take some water. I hope you're feeling okay. That was brilliant. It's so nice to see projects that still come together and still have output, even when they happened right across the middle of the pandemic and working internationally. So there is, let me just open, we have the Q&A. I'll just remind everyone, I can see there's one hand up from the attendees. If you have questions, if you're able to type them into the Q&A and we can answer them as they come through that way. We don't have any questions in there yet, so I guess, I mean, I can start with one or a couple, I guess. Oh, we've had one question come through already. Okay, so this is an anonymous question. So how do you ensure that community-driven vulnerability assessments align with technical data, such as Earth observation outputs in practical disaster risk planning? Hopefully you can see the Q&A as well if you didn't catch any of that.
I can see that. That's a really interesting question. So in terms of this project, I guess we didn't use Earth observation outputs for the reason that that wasn't a capacity that the community had, in terms of that was not ever data that they themselves were going to be able to access. We did work with the geological surveys in both Brazil and Colombia to kind of talk to them about what we were doing and the approaches that we were taking. And so I think there is the potential there to link these two things up. Like, for example, I could see you using Earth observation data in a post-disaster way. Now that we have these kind of really detailed maps of the community, it's obviously going to be much easier to look at how the community's changed if there's been a large landslide or a torrential avenue or something like that. So I think probably whoever you are, anonymous attendee, that might be the next step, is thinking about how you move from these kind of really community-based input-driven out maps to kind of that disaster risk. In terms of planning, I think the community themselves really took these products forward. And what I forgot to say was that we also produce for them, alongside some of this, kind of low cost solutions to disaster risk reduction. So things that they could do with their homes that might, say, reduce the risk of flooding or reduce the risk of landsliding. So we sort of went that way with it, in that kind of community-based solutions. I hope that answers the question. I've not just rambled.
Yeah, no. I think that addresses like the three different points in the question. And it quite nicely leads into the next question that's come through as well. It's another anonymous one, which is about the legacy of the project. So the question is, what was the strategy applied to have legacy within this project? They've also praised you and said that was awesome work and a really good presentation.
Um, I don't think we can take credit for creating a strategy. I really don't. I mean, this was such a unique project in a lot of ways. The pandemic made it unique. We could not get out there. And our community members were under so many stresses because of the pandemic. But I really, especially in El Pacifico, and I should say in Proventorio as well, in Brazil as well, they really did take on board the routines and what we were doing. And by the end of the project, they really sort of developed a great understanding, and they were moving forward really well. But I think especially in El Pacifico, the community leaders are so aware of what their hazards are and what climate change is going to mean for them as a community. They had been given in the past the opportunity to relocate the community because of these hazards, and they identified that might make them physically less vulnerable, but socially more vulnerable, because the community would be split up. And so they really want to stay where they are. And so I think the legacy of the project really has to be a credit to them, because they just took it and they sort of just ran with it, and they've done this great work. I should also credit João. I don't know if he's listening to this, but obviously the PI of the project as well was really kind of intrinsically, it was all about that kind of equitable development and that equitable understanding of hazard.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. And I think been another question come through, but I might just very quickly interject with mine. Is that you said this was attached to Commune 8 in Medellin, and obviously it's international press associated with it and lots of attention and lots of engagement from the community. I guess this project has only very recently ended, but do you know if there has been interest from neighbouring communes or any enthusiasm to have, oh, can we have this in our
Yeah, so
small?
that's exactly what the people in El Pacifico identified. So that's why they have been running this risk school. So that is to give that kind of overview and understanding to those neighbouring communes. And my understanding is that is now being applied or is starting to be applied elsewhere, which is great. From our perspective, I just think that, that is what you want, right? At the end of a project like this, you want to think that actually the community capacity has been increased and that they are then leading that kind of transfer of knowledge. Because fundamentally, I mean, I have never been to El Pacifico. I could never go to El Pacifico. So I am not the authority on it, right? They are. And all that we've really done here is kind of facilitated a collection of information in a way that gives them the results that they need, right?
Yeah, no, it's great to hear. It's the momentum and it's the self-seeding. It's really cool. This next question that's come through is how can the findings from this project inform future research projects or projects in similar self-constructed communities facing natural hazards? Also, how can the findings from this project inform? Oh, that's the same question. I think that's the same
Okay.
question twice.
All
Yeah.
right. Um, so I mean, I think that an approach like the approach that we took here could be replicated anywhere, as long as you had enough community buy-in to get started. And I think probably that's where the trust comes in and the trusted relationship comes in. And that's again why I would say that, I have to credit my Colombian colleagues because they've been working in this community for a long time. So they have that trust and it's already kind of established. I think what I would say is that it's not a quick process, right? It's not something that you could do, in a matter of an afternoon. Like that iteration and having the ability to go back to the community, clarify things, get them kind of more on board with what you're doing, I think is why we had the outputs that we had. So I would say that it's probably quite an intensive way to do this sort of project. So you probably would want to fit it. It wouldn't be a solution for every community, let's put it that way. I think you'd want to fit it to where you're working. That being said, I mean, certainly for me, it's been a project where we've had some of the best outcomes in terms of community uptake and longevity. So, I mean, I guess in a way, you get out what you put in, right? Like effort in, effort out. So.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. We haven't had any more questions on the Q&A, so I guess last chance to kind of get them typing. I'm just going to ask one more whilst a few more come through. So you said that the model itself was like an Excel spreadsheet that could be filled in, but you also showed kind of hand-drawn maps and paper maps. How did you find kind of I guess, openness to using like the technology, and how did you find integrate using sort of analog and digital sources together and so on?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it actually came down to generations, different generations. So we had some young people in the communities who were really keen on learning Python, on coding, on getting their hands on all these kind of things. So they were really great at kind of working hard on taking up those ideas. Actually, one of the community researchers in Brazil, I think, got a bit frustrated that we hadn't written it in Python because she was so keen to do more Python. But so I think there were those kind of side of the sort of younger generation really driving some of that. I think we also they just had a lot of interest from members of the community and having that ability to kind of transfer between that hand-drawn understanding and I'm not sure if I don't think we even ever thought about doing like a GIS exercise because of the computing requirements. And I'm not sure if we could have done, honestly, maybe we could have done, but with the pandemic and with resourcing, it was just too tricky to kind of think about. So we went for, yeah, the path of least resistance in that case.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's just one more question that's come in. I think might be a tricky one to answer, and it's a bit more, I guess, about the legacy of the project.
Yeah.
But the question is, what mechanisms are in place to ensure the sustainability and ongoing use of the maps and assessments by the community and local authorities? So some big picture stuff, I guess.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think so. There's a few things here. I think those maps, they are predicated on the community's and perception of hazards. And I expect that perception to change, to shift slightly through time as they deal with maybe more landslides or another large flooding event. They may find that their sort of perception of hazard shifts a bit, and therefore they may wish to kind of edit those hazard maps. The way that we have set up what we've given them, they should be able to do that. I know that they still work very closely. So just because this project has ended does not mean that my Colombian colleagues are no longer working in that community. So they still work very closely with Colombian colleagues at universities in Medellin who would help them with that. I think in terms of making sure that there's kind of longevity and ongoing uptake by local authorities, that really comes down to the communities advocating for that. And they have the information to do that advocating. In terms of kind of really, really long term, I think, I'm not sure. I don't know yet. Maybe ask me in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I think that's more than fair. I was going to call it there. We've just had one more last question come through, and it's not an anonymous question. This is from
No,
Raymond
it's because
Patrick
I know
Maxim.
him.
So it says, "Hi Annie, great work. My question is to ensure sustainability. Is there a move to sort of put this into a platform like what's being done here in the Philippines with GeoRisk PH?"
Please, Raymond, I would really like to do that. I think we have spoken to, so Raymond, I should say, is from FIVOLX in the Philippines, and he and I have known each other for quite some time. And I've been working a lot in the Philippines as well. And we have spoken to some of the team leaders at FIVOLX about whether or not this kind of approach could be used. I think in the end, like the output from this is a map. So putting it in a platform like GeoRisk would be completely possible because that is a spatial platform, right? It's a mapped platform. I think in terms of, I know GeoRisk is more of a national scale output, Raymond. So I think in terms of that, it would be about considering what vulnerability criteria are applicable across the Philippines, and whether or not you could tune the data to that. But we have been speaking with some of your colleagues about that in terms of the multi-hazard modelling toolbox and things like that.
Cool. Yeah, it's nice to see transferability. I was gonna call it there because I think you've done a good 20 minutes of questions, but there is one very quick one that's just come in, and this will be the last question, and we'll kind of you've done a good answer. This one does apologize by saying sorry if it's been missed, but to what extent did this project build on previous work on disaster risk management that was co-produced between the community and other universities in 2017 to 2019? And if so, how did the earlier processes help this project and the ones you've presented?
So what I would say is that, so as I said, El Pacifico has got a really good understanding of their hazard and their risk, and that is because of work like sorry, Harry is referring to. So they are quite familiar with dealing with academics, with universities. They understand the intricacies of what you're talking about very quickly. So I did have somebody in one of the first meetings, I was just sort of like throwing out ideas, and one of them just sort of went, "No, I don't want an index. I don't want an index value. That's not useful." And I was like, "Oh, okay, fine." So I would say that all the work that's been done with the community in the past has really kind of given them the knowledge to advocate for themselves. And I think it's really also built the trust between them and the scientific community. So they see it as I believe, as a two-way relationship. They don't feel like people have come in and taken things and then just kind of never spoken to them again, which I can only really credit the other projects that worked there before, because it really obviously did lay the groundwork that meant that we were able to do this piece of work in this very kind of co-produced, co-developed way.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's really good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Annie, for answering all of those questions and for presenting today. It's been really great to get an insight into some of this work that's from our COMET scientists. Our May COMET seminar will be coming towards the end of the month and details will be out very soon. But otherwise, thank you to everyone that's joined us today and we'll see you next month. And thanks again to our speaker.
You.